When we think of the story of Adam and Eve, the names of their best-known children, Cain, Abel, and Seth, immediately come to mind. However, the Bible mentions that the couple had other sons and daughters, information that is often ignored. These descendants, especially daughters, remain almost invisible in both the biblical text and religious traditions. The biblical narrative, over the centuries, prioritized the events involving Cain, Abel, and Seth, highlighting tragedies such as the first homicide and Seth's role as the continuator of the sacred lineage. But who were the other daughters of Adam and Eve? What was their role in the formation of the first human societies? These questions remain largely unanswered in the official canon of the Bible. On the other hand, apocryphal texts and secondary traditions attempt to fill these gaps, bringing to light fascinating details about the lives of these women who also made up the early history of humanity. These accounts, while controversial, provide new perspectives and enrich our understanding of early human history. In this video, we will explore the available accounts, analyzing what both the scriptures and non-canonical texts say. This is an invitation to rediscover these often forgotten figures and understand their importance in a history that goes far beyond the most famous names. The story of Cain and Abel is, without a doubt, one of the best known in Genesis and in the entire biblical narrative. These two brothers, direct children of Adam and Eve, represent the first human conflict recorded in Scripture, marked by rejection, jealousy, and, tragically, humanity's first homicide. This narrative captivates the imagination of readers, scholars, and religious people, being a symbol of moral and spiritual lessons. Cain, the firstborn, offers God a sacrifice that is not accepted, while the offering of Abel, his younger brother, pleases the Lord. The result is an act of anger and envy that culminates in Cain's murder of Abel. The impact of this story is so profound that it has become central to many religious traditions, explored as an example of the consequences of sin, disobedience, and the struggle for divine acceptance. However, this emphasis on the tragedy between the two brothers often overshadows the existence and role of Adam and Eve's other descendants. The almost exclusive attention to Cain and Abel leaves the couple's daughters, and even other sons, such as Seth, remain relegated to a secondary role or completely ignored in discussions and interpretations. It is important to recognize that the rivalry between Cain and Abel, despite its relevance, is only one part of the complex history of the first human family. There is much more to explore and understand about how the other sons and daughters of Adam and Eve contributed to the formation of the first human communities and how these stories connect to the spiritual legacy we know today. Adam and Eve, according to the biblical account, were not only the first humans, but also responsible for a vast and varied offspring that gave rise to humanity. The book of Genesis, chapter 5, verses 4 and 5, reveals to us that Adam lived 930 years, during which he fathered sons and daughters. Despite this mention, the focus of religious narratives often falls on their sons, such as Cain, Abel, and Seth, leaving their daughters practically forgotten in history. Think about the magnitude of this statement. 930 years of life made it possible not only to multiply a direct lineage, but also to establish the foundations for the first human communities. These sons and daughters of Adam and Eve not only perpetuated the species, but were also instrumental in forming the first social and cultural structures. However, what do we know about them? The daughters of Adam and Eve, specifically, are mentioned only vaguely and without detail in traditional biblical texts. Their names do not appear, their stories are not told, and their role appears to have been relegated to anonymity. This invisibility can be understood, in part, as a reflection of the historical and cultural context in which these texts were recorded, in which the emphasis fell on men, their deeds, and their lineages. Still, it is undeniable that these daughters played a crucial role. After all, how would humanity's population growth be possible without them? Not only were they an essential part of demographic expansion, but they must also have played important social roles in the first generations. Some traditions and apocryphal texts attempt to fill this gap, attributing to these women identities and stories that, although not officially recognized, enrich our understanding of this period in human history. These additional mentions, however rare, help us rethink the limited view we often have of Adam and Eve's daughters. They were not just shadows in a male-dominated background. They were fundamental pieces in the puzzle of human origins. As we explore these gaps, we also reflect on how the biblical narrative shapes our historical and spiritual understanding. If Scripture leaves these figures unnamed, who were these women? What do we know of his achievements? These mysteries continue to fascinate scholars and believers in search of answers. While the official biblical narrative focuses on Cain, Abel, and Seth, some sources outside the canon, known as apocryphal texts, offer new perspectives on the descent of Adam and Eve. These texts, although not considered holy scripture by most religious traditions, serve as complementary pieces to fill in the gaps left in Genesis and provide broader insight into the earliest times of humanity. One of these notable texts is the Book of Jubilees, also called Little Genesis. This apocryphal book mentions details that are not in the traditional account, including the names of some of Adam and Eve's daughters. These figures, such as Awan and Azura, are identified as the wives of Cain and Seth, respectively, and play important roles in the continuity of the human lineage. The Book of Jubilees not only names these daughters, but also describes aspects of their lives and their contributions to the development of the first human communities. This information helps to clarify the role of women in the early history of humanity, something that the traditional biblical narrative addresses in a limited way. Why, then, are these stories not part of the official canon? There are many reasons for this. Apocryphal texts, such as the Book of Jubilees, were excluded for different factors, such as their uncertain authorship, their historical context, or because they present interpretations that differ from the most widely accepted traditions. Yet even outside the canon, they are valuable sources for understanding how people throughout history have interpreted and expanded biblical stories. These apocryphal texts also show us how alive and diverse religious traditions are. Different communities have sought answers to unresolved questions in the biblical text, adding details and stories that reflect their own beliefs and values. For many, these accounts offer a richer, more human dimension to the stories of Adam and Eve and their descendants. The Book of Jubilees, also known as Little Genesis, is a fascinating source for anyone looking to deepen their understanding of the descendants of Adam and Eve. This apocryphal text, written around the 2nd century BC, offers details that go beyond what is recorded in the narrative official Bible. Among these details are the names and roles of some of Adam and Eve's daughters, figures who remain anonymous in Genesis. According to the Book of Jubilees, 2 of Adam and Eve's daughters stand out: Cloud and Azura. Awan is identified as Cain's wife, while Azura becomes Seth's wife. These names, although absent from the official biblical text, help fill in gaps about how the first human generations connected and expanded. More than that, their stories offer a new perspective on the importance of women in the beginning of humanity. The Book of Jubilees describes Awan and Azura as central figures in the continuity of the human lineage. Awan, for example, is mentioned as part of Cain's journey after his exile, becoming a fundamental part of the emergence of a new generation. Azura, upon joining Seth, is directly associated with the lineage that will later include important figures such as Enos, Enoch, and Noah. It is important to highlight, however, that the Book of Jubilees is not part of the official canon of the Bible, being considered apocryphal in both Judaism and Christianity. Its exclusion is related to factors such as uncertain authorship, doctrinal differences, and lack of recognition by religious leaders of predominant traditions. Despite this, it is valued by some religious groups and scholars as a rich source of historical and theological information. Additionally, the Book of Jubilees offers a more detailed and contextualized interpretation of the events narrated in Genesis, including specific chronologies and additional explanations. For this reason, it is often seen as a supplement for those who wish to explore lesser-known narratives about the origins of humanity. Among the descendants of Adam and Eve, Awan, mentioned in the Book of Jubilees, emerges as a significant figure. Presented as Cain's wife, she plays a key role in the continuity of his lineage. After being banished by God due to the murder of Abel, Cain settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden. There, he forms a family with Awan, and together they begin a new chapter in human history. The biblical text in Genesis 4 verses 16 to 17 reports that, in Nod, Cain had a son named Enoch and built a city that was named after his firstborn son. Although the account does not mention the name of Cain's wife, the book of Jubilees fills this gap by identifying Awan as his companion. This mention brings to life a figure who would otherwise remain invisible in the narrative. The etymology of the name Awan, sometimes translated as potency or vice, reflects the complexity of its history. Not only does it represent the continuation of humanity after the tragedy involving Abel, but it is also associated with the founding of the first city mentioned in the Bible. This city, called Enoch, symbolizes both human reconstruction efforts and the moral and spiritual challenges that arose after history's first great conflict. The union between Cain and Awan highlights how even in the midst of chaos and divine punishment, there was room for new beginnings and advancements. His lineage, although marked by hardship, is a reminder of how humanity has continued to prosper despite early mistakes and tragedies. And as we analyze Awan's role in the Cain narrative, another figure emerges who also carries significant weight in the story of Adam and Eve's descendants, Azura, the wife of Seth. Unlike Cain's lineage, which is often associated with conflict and challenge, Azura is linked to hope and spiritual continuity through Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve. Let's explore how this story contrasts with Awan's and reveals the opposite paths the descendants of the first family took. Azura, another prominent figure in the book of Jubilees, is presented as the wife of Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve. The biblical narrative describes Seth as the descendant who would continue the divine lineage after the tragedy involving Abel. Eve believed that Seth was appointed by God to establish a new generation that would remain faithful to the divine precepts. According to apocryphal tradition, Azura was initially the wife of Abel. After his murder, she became Seth's companion, thus uniting two important branches of the first family. This union not only marked the beginning of a new lineage, but also symbolized the restoration of hope for humanity. Together, Seth and Azura had a son named Enosh, who is mentioned in Genesis as the first to call on the name of the Lord, marking the beginning of formal worship of God. Azura and Seth represent the contrast to Cain's lineage. While Cain's descendants are often associated with spiritual conflicts and challenges, Seth's lineage emerges as an example of righteousness and obedience. From her, notable figures would emerge, such as Enoch, known for walking with God, and Noah, who would play a crucial role in preserving humanity during the flood. Azura's story highlights the importance of female figures in the continuity and spirituality of the first generations. Although often forgotten in official narratives, women like Azura played essential roles in shaping the paths of humanity and laying the foundations for the religious traditions we know today. And as we reflect on Azura's significance in Seth's lineage, it is also essential to consider the impact of her son Enos, whose role transcends genealogy. It is considered the starting point for the institutionalization of spirituality and formal worship. Let's now dive into how Enos influenced religious practice and ushered in a spiritual milestone in human history. Enos, son of Seth and Azura, is a crucial figure in the biblical narrative and occupies a prominent place in the sacred lineage of humanity. According to Genesis 4 verse 26, it was during the days of Enos that men began to call on the name of the Lord. This moment is widely interpreted as the beginning of organized worship and the search for a deeper relationship with God, which many consider the birth of formal spirituality. Enos's role goes beyond being just a genealogical link. It symbolizes a significant transition in human history. Your generation seems to have taken the first steps in building a collective awareness about the importance of faith and spiritual connection. From then on, Seth's lineage began to stand out for its devotion and obedience, contrasting sharply with Cain's lineage, which was marked by moral and spiritual challenges. Enos's influence is not limited to his own generation. He is the starting point of a lineage that would include notable figures such as Enoch, who walked with God and was raptured, and Noah, who would ensure humanity's survival during the flood. Enos is, therefore, one of the foundations for the preservation and expansion of the spiritual tradition that would shape humanity. As we reflect on the importance of Enos, it is impossible not to notice the role of female figures in this lineage. Azura, her mother, and other women from Seth's lineage, often relegated to anonymity, were essential in continuing this story of faith. And this duality between the lineages of Cain and Seth offers us a striking contrast between two trajectories, one marked by challenges and tragedies, and the other by hope and righteousness. Now, we will explore how these two lineages, that of Cain and Awan, and that of Seth and Azura, reflect moral and spiritual choices that shape not only their own generations, but also the destiny of humanity as a whole. The stories of Cain and Seth, as well as their respective wives, Awan and Azura, reveal a fascinating contrast between two lineages that represent opposite paths in the biblical narrative. On the one hand, we have Cain's lineage, marked by tragedies, moral conflicts, and spiritual distancing. On the other, the lineage of Seth, which is often associated with hope, righteousness, and closeness to God. The union of Cain and Awan symbolizes an effort to rebuild after Abel's murder, but their lineage is often remembered for the spiritual challenges and moral deviations faced by their descendants. The city of Enoch, built by Cain, reflects both human ambition and the struggle against the consequences of sin. Their descendants, like Lamech, perpetuate a trajectory of violence and distancing from divine values. Seth and Azura represent the opposite, the search for restoration and the fulfillment of the divine purpose. Through Enos, this lineage is marked by the emergence of formal worship and devotion to God, which establishes a solid foundation for the future patriarchs of humanity. While Cain's lineage follows a path of spiritual separation, Seth's becomes an example of obedience and faith. This contrast not only highlights the duality inherent in the human condition, but also reminds us of the choices that shape future generations. Both lineages carry valuable lessons. While one reflects the consequences of turning away from God, the other inspires us with the possibility of redemption and spiritual renewal. And as we analyze these trajectories, the question arises, how have religious and cultural traditions over the centuries interpreted these stories? Texts such as the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Generations, for example, add layers to these narratives, offering curiosities and interpretations that broaden our understanding. In the next topic, we will explore one of these fascinating traditions, delving into accounts from Islam that bring a unique perspective on the descendants of Adam and Eve. In addition to the Judeo-Christian traditions, Islam also brings interesting accounts about the descendants of Adam and Eve. According to the Book of Generations, a respected secondary source in some Islamic traditions, Cain and Abel were born with twin sisters, who later became their wives. These accounts give names to these female figures: Bali, sister of Abel, and Wat, sister of Cain. According to the narrative, the choice of marriage partners was not well accepted by Cain, who was dissatisfied with his twin sister and wanted to marry Balira, Abel's sister. This discontent would have been one of the factors that fueled the rivalry between the two brothers, culminating in the tragic murder of Abel. Although this version of events is not part of the biblical Genesis, it brings an interesting cultural and theological point of view on the first human conflicts. The Islamic account also sheds light on how these first generations lived in a developing society, dealing with issues of morality, family, and social organization. It is important to highlight that, like the apocryphal texts, these traditions are not part of the official religious canon, but they offer fascinating perspectives that help expand our understanding of the stories of Adam and Eve and their descendants. These narratives show how different cultures and religions interpreted the same events in unique ways, adapting them to reflect their own beliefs and values. Although there is no consensus on the veracity of these accounts, they enrich the story of human origins and invite us to reflect on the impact of traditions on the formation of spirituality. Finally, these curiosities also leave us with intriguing questions. What is the true role of these figures in ancient narratives? How can we interpret these stories in a modern context? And above all, what do these narratives teach us about human choices and their effects on future generations? Did you like this content? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your like. This helps us to continue bringing videos with fascinating stories like this one. Share your opinion in the comments and tell us, which of these narratives caught your attention the most? Let's continue this conversation there. See you in the next video.